Okay, I would like to welcome all of you to the fourth talk in our series, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you tonight, Professor John Haldon, whom I unfortunately had chance to meet quite late. He has been working in Turkey for many years, but I'm still very happy that we get these chances to come together at different occasions. So I'd like to introduce him very briefly, which will be a difficult task because he has been doing a lot of things. And although he is the Emeritus Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of European History and Professor of Byzantine History and Hellenic Studies, he's still very active in the field. His expertise lies in the socioeconomic, institutional, political, and cultural history of the early and middle Byzantine Empire from the 7th to the 11th century. Additionally, he has focused on political systems and structures across both the European and Islamic worlds from late antiquity to the early modern period. His research also explores the environmental history of the Byzantine and Ottoman worlds, examining the intersections between societal change, environment, and climate. And along those lines, Professor Haldon is the director of the Climate Change and History Research Initiative. And as far as I can see from all the events and plans that are ahead of the research initiative, there's a lot of exciting things coming up in 2025. There will be the publication of papers from 2025 colloquium, essays on resilience, sustainability, and systems modeling. And then in April 2025, there will be a workshop on the Anthropocene as heuristic, mobilizing for change and the role of the past. In January 2026, yet another intensive workshop and a colloquium in July 2026 are events to look for by the Climate Change and History Research Initiative. So in addition to this, actually from 2006 to 2016, Professor Haldon served as the director of the Avkat Archaeological Project, an archaeological and historical survey conducted in north-central Turkey. This project is renowned for its innovative integration of traditional field survey methods with cutting-edge survey techniques, mapping, and digital modeling. The Avkat project significantly advanced our understanding of society, economy, land use, demography, and paleo-environmental history during the late Roman, Byzantine, and Seljuk Ottoman periods. It has also been an inspiration for researchers, especially working in the Black Sea region. Professor Haldon has been a member of numerous prestigious institutes, many of which he has also directed. So, without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Professor Haldon to share his talk with us tonight. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Burcu. Can everyone hear me? Yes. So first of all, thanks to Burcu and Maxime for the invitation. It's very kind of them to think of me for this interesting seminar. I've enjoyed the papers that I've been able to get to so far. I hope I enjoy my own as much as I've enjoyed the others. I'm going to use material that I've used before, but in a slightly different context. The one that you can see on the screen, I'm looking at the sort of complex interaction between social, environmental, and political economic changes, particularly in the East Roman world and particularly in Anatolia. Although I'll refer to the Balkans and other parts of the Roman world as necessary as I go through. So to begin with, as we know, Anatolia presents a fairly complex climatic regime with several contrasting patterns, which result from a combination of the collision of air masses from the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean Sea, and Eurasia, together with Anatolia's widely diverse topography, plateau grasslands, forest, desert, and mountains, and so forth. And technically, 7 distinct climate regimes have been identified, which result from this combination of factors. And these are highly variable, both spatially and across time. Paleoclimate and paleoecological data from each of these, even if not always as chronologically refined as we would like, show often very different patterns of warm or cold, arid and moist conditions at the same times. And since the pattern of change was by no means uniform, either chronologically or spatially, drawing causal associations between climate and the wider social, economic and political evolution of the period is particularly challenging. It is, of course, possible to generalize. In the decades around 500 CE, for example, the Mediterranean atmospheric circulation experienced some significant changes, with northern, central, and eastern Anatolia and the northern Levant becoming wetter, while other regions, including the Balkans, Greece, and southwest Anatolia, as well as southern Arabia, became more arid. And we used this map 3 or 4 years ago. But in fact, when I was looking at the data upon which this map was constructed, we can already see substantial nuances which we should have introduced. And so that data is actually, that map rather, is actually rather misleading, and it overly generalizes, as we'll see in a moment. So when we zoom into the specific local data, this picture becomes much more complex, a point recently very strongly reinforced by Jacobson et al. In their article on diverging patterns of climate between the Balkans, the southern Balkans, the Aegean and Western Anatolia. We do now have some pretty well-refined chronologies from several sites in Anatolia and the Balkans for both climate variation as well as land use for the Byzantine period. So in the following, I want to see to what extent we can connect the data that these sites have produced with the social and economic history of the empire between roughly the 6th and 7th century and the 10th and 11th century. Some key sources of our evidence are, first of all, well-dated speleothem data from Uzuntola cave in Thrace, providing a detailed picture of climate conditions in a region close to Istanbul. Equally well-dated stable isotope records from Sofola cave, reflecting the southern Black Sea environment. The pollen data, which is not yet published, but it's near publication, from Lake Yenica near Bolu, indicative of land use changes in this region of the Western Pontic zone. Pollen and climate data from Lake Iznik in Bithynia, the quite well-known Kocain cave data, 38 kilometers north of Antalya, providing a very accurate climatic record for southwest of Anatolia. We also have pollen data now from Lake Buldan, about 50 kilometers northwest of Denizli for the central Meander Valley, also well dated and providing good evidence for the continuity of land use in that area. And then very well dated varves, which I think everybody's heard of now because they're so refined and so precise, from Lake Nar in Cappadocia, indicative of the situation in central Anatolia in respect to both climate and land use. And we can add data from quite a large number of other sites. Some of it's fairly accurate. A lot of it is either needs recalibrating or is not particularly precise. What these proxies show together is, first of all, the variation in chronology of the climatic shifts that took place across these different regions. And very briefly, and I rely here, of course, on the published or forthcoming results of the analyses of the proxies, these indicate the following climatic and or paleoecological signatures. From Uzumtala, new analyses and recalibration of the data from the lake testify to a period of relatively humid and stable conditions lasting from about 350 up to 690 CE, followed by the onset of a dry phase from 690 to 740, and a subsequent more humid phase that lasted well up into the 11th century. And just in order to, if you want to read the graph there, you can see how that's represented formally. We also have the records from Sofala and Nar, which demonstrate a relatively dry late antique phase from 300 to 500, followed by a rapid change to a much wetter climate from the late 5th century, persisting into the 8th century at Nar and the late 7th century at Sofala. And this is paralleled also by slightly less precise records from Lake Tedja to the northeast of Nar. There's a dry phase that lasts from the middle of the 8th century up until the middle of the 10th century, and then you have slightly more humid conditions. And in terms of land use, the pollen show little or no change to local land use patterns in the late Roman period, right up to the middle of the 7th century, when there seems to be a complete collapse of agriculture from the 660s, and with a recovery only in the middle of the 10th century. And I'll come back to that later. And here there's the chart that I've taken from Roberts et al. In 2018, just showing the century average Z scores for climate change using both the NAR and SOFALAR data. Lake Yenichaa, which you can see on the map there, is in the Pontic, Western Pontic Mountains, or the very tail end of them, and is located at the natural limit above sea level for olive cultivation. The pollen evidence from here indicates a short period of olive cultivation ending round about 580, as well as other indicators for reduced demographic pressure on the local landscape in the 6th and early 7th centuries, evidenced in the recovery of woodland pollen taxa. And we also have some slight evidence for the continuity or the increase in agro-pastoral economic mode. I think I've got the summary pollen diagram there. And this data indicates both a decline in vine cultivation shortly after the middle of the, shortly after the early, after 600-ish, which coincides with the onset of somewhat more arid conditions, although this change in climate is not particularly well dated. Climate may have played a role in this, but there may have been other factors as well. There's also evidence for continuing pastoralism here, but at a reduced level. Interestingly, Owen Doonan's archaeological survey in the Sinop region has produced very good evidence for the growth and then the end of a thriving olive cultivation, although until now the data has remained unclear. And the new data from Yenichaa might perhaps strengthen a late 6th century date, which has often been proposed for this process, although other dates have also been suggested. Along with clear indications of a substantial reduction in rural settlement numbers and density around Yenichaa, we have here, and also from a closely neighbouring area, some evidence to corroborate the idea of a significant but very localized change in conditions. Interestingly, the data also indicate short-lived periods of increased wheat cultivation in the 580s to early 7th century. This corresponds, or at least parallels, an apparent decline in vine pollen percentages. And then in the 670s, there are some very slight indications of the appearance of more resistant crops of barley and rye, but this fades away again in the early 8th century. And then from the middle of the 8th century, or the early 9th, there seems to be a more permanent recovery in agriculture, initially barley and rye, but with some wheat and oats combined with grazing weeds indicative of livestock. And this is then gradually superseded by tree crops, walnut, hazel, chestnut, olive, vine, especially from the very late 8th or early 9th century. So already with just 3 or 4 examples, we can see the wide variety, obviously reflective of local geographical conditions as well. Pollen and paleoclimate data from Lake Iznik, probably you all know where Lake Iznik is, but I put the map up for those who may not. Much closer to Istanbul / Constantinople, and within the so-called Marmara transition zone, which I just referred to. This is part of the Uzumtala zone, as it were. These paint a slightly different picture again. And here, the onset of a slightly more arid climate can be dated to around about 580 to 600, intensifying from 660 and lasting into the second half of the 8th century. This is paralleled again by a decline in olive production, or at least olive pollen, as well as in other crops, including cereals. But since the temporal variation is 57 years plus minus, resolution is not precise enough to really tie this into anything other than the locality itself. But note that this is a different picture again from that suggested by the data from Uzumtala, indicating a northern and a southern facet of the Marmara transition zone as a whole. If we prefer a mid-7th century date for the decline of oleoculture, we could perhaps attribute the decline to anthropogenic causes. For example, the intensive Arab attacks in the Constantinople region from the 660s and the 690s, leading up to the great siege of the city in 717-718, as documented very carefully by Marek Jankowiak, for example, based on episcopal signatories to the acts of the councils of Constantinople in that period. An earlier association, given this plus minus 57, of course, an earlier association might suggest the demographic impact of the Justinianic plague, or a shift in local market demand, and or commercial networks, or indeed a combination of all of these. This aridity lasts until about 800 and is followed then at Iznik by a more humid climate, with evidence for a significant recovery of agriculture, including vines and cereals. Kocain Cave, which is another important record, climatically, the pattern here is the inverse of that which prevailed in the central regions. Southwestern Anatolia shared many similarities with the Aegean and South Balkan zone, with high effective moisture and precipitation between 330 and 460 CE, followed by a rapid shift to drier conditions that persisted until the 830s, punctuated by short periods of wetter conditions in the later 6th, later 7th, and later 8th centuries. For the period from 350 to 600, there is a recent detailed survey of the archaeology showed that this so-called arid period witnessed, in fact, the high point of settlement density, although there was also a clear move from inland to coastal population centres, indicative perhaps of pressure on more exposed upland regions. But the area fared similarly to other areas in the course of the 7th century in general, with settlement abandonment and contraction, suggestive of a population reduction and a shift from the traditional pattern of agriculture to a more pastoralist or agro-pastoralist system. Now, I've nearly finished going through this catalogue, but the final one I wanted to mention is Lake Buldan in the central Meander Valley. Here, both olive and cereal pollen percentages decline dramatically around the middle of the 7th century, and you get secondary pine forest regrowth. But there is some evidence of continuity. And this coincides again archaeologically with the abandonment of the ancient city of Tripolis in the decades after 650, likely a result of its exposed position on one of the major invasion routes into the empire, which was deployed by Arab invaders between the 660s and later 8th century. 200 years later, though, in the middle of the 9th century, the pollen data indicate a recovery, with the emphasis now no longer, as in the late Roman period, on olives, but on cereal cultivation and on livestock. So what emerges from the evidence, and I apologize for going through this catalogue, I just wanted to stress the variations that we have from our data. What emerges from this evidence, from these widely separate regions, is the importance of spatial heterogeneity of climate in Anatolia as a whole. In particular, it's worth pointing to the fact that while central and western Anatolia, along with Thrace, present a very broad, a centennial degree of spatial coherence in temperature and precipitation, the significant improvement in humidity in the Marmara transition zone around Constantinople, as indicated in the Uzuntaler data, from the 740s onward, contrasts with an increasingly arid climate in central and northern Anatolia from the same time. And I'll just put, this is from an article to which I've contributed a little, Morgan et al. Forthcoming. It will appear sometime in the next few months, I think. But that map gives you a good indication of how that zone works in terms of climate impact for that particular region. It also has a number of the key sites marked on it as well, as you can see. A further point is that the general trend in the Balkans, Greece, and southwest Anatolia during the first millennium runs counter, but with periodic exceptions, to that which can be reconstructed for the rest of Anatolia and for the northern Levant, and as well as for Central Europe. And we need to integrate these factors more carefully into the regional and sub-regional histories of both broader zones when thinking about their social and political historical evolution. I'm not going to discuss the so-called late antique Little Ice Age, or Lalia, in detail. I'm sure everyone is familiar with it, but this already complex picture has to be further nuanced by the evidence from tree rings and speleothems from the Alps, Central Europe, and the Altai Mountains in Eastern Asia that indicate colder and drier climate during the first half of the 6th century, marked in particular from the late 530s and probably triggered by a major explosive volcanic eruption in the tropics, which made the 540s the coldest decade within the so-called Dark Ages cold period, which is a recently coined term to describe the climatic conditions across the Northern Hemisphere from about the middle of the 5th to the beginning of the 9th century CE. So, but the exact impact of these conditions on, for example, lowland areas remain to be determined. It's obvious that crops and economic activities carried on in the highlands will be more directly affected by a reduction in temperature than those in lowlands, where average or mean temperatures tend to be slightly above those in the high grounds. There are some indications, though, around from both the ISNIC record and the NHI record that maybe we can see the effects of this period of cooler weather in the decline of the olive pollen percentages from those lakes. But whether this was the case remains to be determined. Finally, we do need more data about temperature, which together with the data for effective moisture, which is the key to the success of crops such as wheat needing sufficient seasonal rainfall, this can tell us more about the potential for climate shifts to damage output than any broad generalizations about cool or cooler and warm or arid. And one of the problems with the climatological reconstructions and the climate data that we have is that it's not always clear what the temperature differentials are between the improving or less improved conditions and those which went before or came afterwards. And we need, therefore, to think about the tolerances, the temperature tolerances of the different crops that we're concerned with. So I haven't included it in this talk, but I was doing some work the other day on temperature tolerances for wheat, and they're much wider than I thought they were. And it seems not only that, but crops, cereals in particular, can acclimatize to change conditions if they're given time. So the onset of a long cooler period, for example, might damage a crop for the first generation or two, but the crop itself will learn, as it were, to acclimatize, providing, of course, the extremes aren't too extreme. So there are things that we don't know about that we should know about. At least I'm certainly ignorant on these things. And I suddenly realized that there are a lot of factors which we need to take into account if we're going to make any successful effort to try to work out how people responded to small shifts in climate as well as big shifts in climate. So it's important to consider and bear in mind that there are plenty of examples across the Holocene of very dry climatic conditions where the local population appears to have been relatively unafflicted or even to have prospered. The evidence from Kocain Cave, for example, is quite clear that Greek colonization begins in the region during exceptionally dry conditions in the middle of the Iron Age, round about 800 BCE. While during the so-called Roman climate optimum from the 1st century BCE into the 2nd century CE, agriculture thrived in this region of southwestern Anatolia in spite of relatively low effective moisture. For late antiquity, the shift to drier conditions occurred at least a century earlier than the reduction in settlement numbers and investment, with a move away from agriculture and towards pastoralism, which can be broadly dated to somewhere between 550 and 650. But what drier, in quotes, and warmer actually means in respect of a given crop is often unclear. And as I said, thinking about wheat, we have to be much more careful about what we're talking about in terms of which crops are grown where, under what conditions, and in what climate circumstances. In a context of extreme cold, the greatest damage to cereals occurs, interestingly, when the soil is dry. Dry soil warms up and cools down 6 times faster than moist. You can tell I've just been reading about this. So these are all factors that need to be taken into account. And as far as I'm aware, nobody's really written about this. Paul Erdkamp, I think, has done some work on this for the High Roman period. And some scholars working on ancient Greece have also done similar work on this sort of thing. But I don't think any of them, certainly not for Byzantium, any medievalist colleagues have been taking these sorts of factors into account. Now, some of it's because we don't have enough data, of course. So there are plenty of reasons why. But nevertheless, these are things which one rarely hears mentioned, and I think it's worth bringing them to everyone's attention. So this is a very amateurish table I drew up yesterday, simply to incorporate the data from the various data sources that we have, to give you a sort of graphic colored picture of the differences just across Anatolia, of different regions and different sites at different times. It's not of any scientific value, but it's indicative of the variations that I wanted to talk about. So, to what extent do the patterns revealed by these data find any echo in the historical and archaeological record for the late Roman and Byzantine world? While it's obvious that that differentiating between anthropogenic and climate-driven impacts is rarely straightforward and sometimes not possible, in the case of the Byzantine world, there are some good examples that we can use to demonstrate some, to use as a model, if you like, of how to approach the problem. So at the most general level in Anatolia, as you'll have gathered from some of the points I made near the beginning, the pollen data suggest that in the course of the 6th and especially from the later 7th century, the classic late ancient agrarian tradition, characterized by a mixed regime of vine, cereal, and olive production around the Mediterranean and Aegean coastal plains and river valleys, receded, to be gradually replaced at different rates according to area, either by a more limited range of crops, or in some cases by natural vegetation and woodland regrowth. The chronology is sometimes poorly defined, but there are enough well-dated data to suggest that while the process started earlier or later in some areas than others, the general shift appears to be focused on the middle of the 7th, or from the first half of the 7th into the middle and second half of the 8th century. And this is indicated by a number of proxies across Asia Minor, or Anatolia, as you can see in this table, including some of those I've discussed already. And in spite of some imprecision in the chronologies, as I've just said, and the fact that at some places the change took place probably in the late 5th or early 6th century, the broad trend clearly points to the period from the late 6th into the 8th as the period across which these changes occurred. This evidence points clearly to two developments. First, an increase in the importance of cereal production and livestock raising compared with the other crops, which came to dominate in many, but not all areas, although it needs to be said at a much lower density than hitherto. So it's a relative increase, not an absolute increase, in the importance of an agro-pastoralist economy. But second, the considerably reduced pollen percentages for all crops indicates an extremely significant, if not dramatic, demographic decline. Here's a chart. This actually needs updating now. We produced this back in 2017, 2018, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. However, when I looked at the most recent pollen data that we have from some of the sites I just mentioned, like Buldan, Lake Buldan, Yenica, and also for Uzantala, or the Uzantala region, I don't think it'll make very much difference to the way this chart looks now. But it does need to be updated. For the present purposes, it usefully reflects what we know about the changes that took place across Anatolia more broadly. The cultivation of vines, and particularly of olives, recedes dramatically, and there's a considerable reduction in the presence of pollen from fruit trees of all types. The pattern represented by the pollen data therefore reflects what the archaeological picture indicates: transformation of the late antique urban network, demographic contraction, followed by the slow recovery of a very different sort of urban life from the later 9th century, and in Anatolia, and a little later in the South Balkans. The recovery of rural economies is indicated in site and regional surveys and in the numismatic and ceramic data, indicative of increasing commercial and exchange activity from the later 9th century, is likewise corroborated. But, of course, as I said, with very strong regional variations, even within this common pattern of, if you like, decline and then recovery. And as the agricultural and land use picture evolves, the simplified and more diverse pattern of land use is accompanied by a general trend, especially in the centre and southwest, clearly defined by the later 10th century, towards a much more agro-pastoral regime in which cereals, livestock, and possibly dairy production dominated. Olive and vine culture recover, but not to the extent that existed before the 7th century. And the reduced output, in this case, likely reflects a radical change over the centuries in consumption patterns, markets, and so forth. We also need to take into account, and this is particularly important for the central part of Anatolia, local agricultural traditions, where, of course, viticulture and oleoculture were much sparser, and where an agro-pastoral tradition was, along with cereals, where the geography was suitable, was much more common. So, as a good example, the case of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, where the faunal record from the excavations indicates that in the late Roman and early Byzantine period, there was a mixed agro-pastoral economy. But while there's a clear emphasis on livestock, this seems to intensify with the evidence from the 10th and 11th centuries. So there seems to be this general trend, certainly in the centre, if not elsewhere, towards increasing the proportion of economic resources devoted to stock raising, livestock raising, and so forth. So now I want to look at some illustrations, if you like, of how this sort of data can fit into the broader picture of social and economic changes. So we can see, as I already noted, we'll just repeat that slide again. While absolute pollen percentages decline very substantially from their 6th century levels, those for cereals appear to increase at many places, not all, for some other crops, relative to those for other crops. In particular, fruit trees, olive and vine go down in proportion against cereal and weeds associated with livestock. For central and northern Anatolia, as I've already said, the data point to a generally wetter regime from the middle of the 6th century into the 8th century. This, particularly when coupled with the somewhat cooler seasonal temperatures also indicated by the paleoclimatic data, and also incidentally reflected to some extent in textual references, would have been very favourable for improved or extended cereal or intensified cereal cultivation, which requires extended winter rainfall or winter precipitation. Can be in form of snow, of course. While the change in the pattern of agricultural production may have coincided in some areas with a shift to a wetter climate, this was clearly not the case in others, and so such changes in land use and the pattern of agricultural production can't really be linked to climate. There are some coincidences, but there are many places where there is a significant change in the pollen record, but no climatic shift at all. So the sorts of changes that we can see in the pollen record may often reflect choices made by or imposed upon farming communities. A similar point has been made by Peter Toneman in his monograph on the Meander Valley, for example, and these may be for a whole range of reasons. So assuming we can exclude at this period shifts in staple dietary habits, I think there are 3 possibilities. First of all, shifting market demand. Secondly, pressures from warfare and insecurity. And then thirdly, pressures from a third party, such as a landlord or the state. It's now well established, and again, I think those of you who work in the Byzantine world will know this extremely well, that across the course of the 7th century, international markets shrank or changed, local markets redirected their focus, so demand for a wide range of products must have been fairly dramatically affected. This certainly seems to have impacted olive and vine cultivation. At the same time, inland regions, in particular, became more than ever reliant on locally produced resources. Many regions were also negatively impacted by warfare and insecurity well into the 8th century, and the best example is the one I've worked on. The pollen evidence from Lake Nile in Cappadocia coincides with good historical information from several sources, Arab, Armenian, and Greek, to show that a period of continuous raiding and enemy occupation of Cappadocia between 664 and 678 led to a near complete collapse of agriculture in the area. And there are now other examples. We have an example from Crete, as well as from Bithynia, that may reflect a similar situation. Such a dramatic impact may not have been very common. We shouldn't assume that that was a universal, but that it could occur is made clear by this example. Another reason for a change in the pattern of agrarian production lay, in my view, with the fiscal and related demands of the Roman state, which had to negotiate both a crisis in resources as well as one of a military political nature. By the 640s, and following the loss of the eastern provinces and the enormous fiscal revenues they generated, the imperial armies had been withdrawn into Anatolia. These calculations are based on a complex range of figures dating from the 5th right into the 6th century, and then also using Ottoman documents from the 16th century, which provide us with a fairly good picture of the production of parts of Anatolia and later in the 16th century parts of Syria. And so working back from that and working forward from our late Roman data, we can generate a picture of the sorts of proportions between the different provinces of the late Roman, the East Roman Empire in the 6th century. And it comes out at something like that. So Anatolia as a whole doesn't produce very much of the Eastern Roman state's budget. Greater Syria is enormously more wealthy. Egypt, of course, produced both the wheat that supported Constantinople and other cities, as also a huge tax revenue. And then additionally, Africa produced 12%, quite a lot in terms of wheat. Other provinces, much less. These are, of course, approximations. If you ask me to prove these figures, I can't. What I can do is point you to the relevant data, which give us some indication of roughly what the proportionality between these different provinces might have been. The imperial armies were distributed according to logistical as well as strategic needs. That seems to be clear. And as an example, it's noticeable that the smallest army of the so-called Armeniakon in the east, number 12 there, occupied an extensive region of East Anatolia. That was the lowest productive region within Anatolia. The other provinces, the other armies seem to have been settled, like this small army of Armeniakon, in regions which could properly support them. And so it's not surprising that substantial armies were based in and around Constantinople, relying on the hinterland, as well as in the west and based in Cappadocia and southern Galatia. Again, these figures are hypothetical based on late Roman statistics and some Byzantine incidental sources, but they give some idea of the proportional size of the different forces. And it is pretty remarkable and very obvious that that small army of Armeniakon is spread across that huge region, made up of a number of late Roman provinces. There are also some interesting changes in technical language to do with tax collection, which took place in the second half, the last third, and the first quarter of the 7th century and the first quarter of the 8th century, indicating some important restructurings of the fiscal administration of the empire, and which were focused in particular on the supply and management of grain. And these shifts took place just at the point when the empire was at its most challenged in terms of resource provision and resource allocation. The importance of grain cannot be underestimated. After 642, the government lost access to the massive grain supplies delivered annually from Egypt, which were now under Islamic control. This is a substantial loss, affecting both the government's ability to feed the population of the capital, Constantinople, as well as supply some of its armies, especially those in the Balkans. Just start that off. Locating new supplies of grain became a matter of urgency. And again, the 7th century sigillographic data from lead seals of officials connected with fiscal system seem to indicate the shifting pattern of the government's attempts to locate sound resources in grain. Egypt has gone. After the 690s, North Africa is no longer available. Sicily, in the later 7th and early 8th century, seems to be important, but because of its precarious position strategically and exposed to Arab Islamic sea raiding, that also becomes problematic. Neither Thrace nor Bithynia were unharmed by hostile attacks, and in any case didn't provide a huge amount The area that ends up seeming, as far as I can tell from the evidence, to become particularly important at this time, at least, is Paphlagonia Pontus. And I've done some work on this. I'm not going to repeat it here, but it does seem that Paphlagonia Pontus, which had long been an important source of wheat, retained or maybe improved its position in this respect. So it seems a reasonable working hypothesis that what we see reflected in the changing pattern of agricultural production reflected in the pollen record, in association with these administrative changes, may well be the outcome of a state-directed adaptive shift in resource production to respond to the crisis it was facing. Such a strategy was directed specifically towards generating the resources the government needed to feed and field its armies. This sort of policy is not at all unprecedented. For example, in 5th century Italy, attested in both imperial legislation as well as in the archaeology of the South Italian countryside, and in particular with regard to the construction of granaries, where the government clearly directed major landowners to produce grain specifically for the purposes of supporting the imperial armies. The focus on cereal and livestock seems to be repeated in the admittedly still very sparse archaeological data. And without going into more details, we seem to have a good case here for an entirely anthropogenic cause behind some of the important changes in land use patterns across a large part of Anatolia. Now, one possible historical and archaeological indicator of this complex combination of developments may be illustrated by the fortunes of the small, semi-rural, semi-urban settlement of Efkaita in the Pontus, located on the northern edge of the Anatolian plateau and in a historically relatively well-documented grain-producing region not far to the west of the major centre of Amasya. This is the project which Burcu mentioned in her kind introduction. During the Roman period, it seems to Efkaita, that is, or Avkat as it was known up until it was renamed in the 1950s as Beozu. During the Roman period, the place was little more than an obscure farmstead. We don't hear anything of it. But from the 4th century, when it is first mentioned in the sources, it began to gain a reputation as the centre of the cult of Saint Theodore the Recruit. It was walled in the early 6th century. Here we are. There are the two Theodores. It was walled in the early the early 6th century by Anastasius and raised to the status of a bishopric. From the 7th century, with the Arab Islamic conquest of the Eastern Roman provinces and the retreat of the Roman, now Byzantine frontier into Anatolia, Efkaita became, it seems, a significant military base behind the frontier. I put that ivory diptych there is 10th century. There are two Theodores because there seems to be a common trend in the 9th century for soldier saints to develop a senior officer twin, as it were. So Theodore the Recruit is obviously a recruit, but Saint Theodore the Stratilatis is Saint Theodore the General. And there are several examples of saints who twin in this way. Saint Mercurius, for example, Saint Demetrius, Saint George, and so forth. Now, interestingly, the ceramic material from our survey, which covers all periods from the Chalcolithic to the late Ottoman, shows an unusual and relatively high density of early Byzantine, i.e. 7th to 9th century material, compared with that from the Middle Byzantine period of the 9th to 12th century. Suggestive, we think, of a greater strategic and economic function for the settlement in this earlier period. Efkaita lay at the heart of an extensive cereal growing district, and it still is. And this apparent continued presence of material datable to the later 7th century up to the 9th century and then beyond, and the continued occupation or at least functional use of a number of sites identified as farmsteads in the immediate hinterland of the city seems to us to be significant. So if you look at the key to those charts, you'll see in the late Roman period, we have the location of Avkat or Beozu there in the hatching. But the number of settlements or the number of foci where we found evidence of workshops and or settlement or ceramics of both domestic and non-domestic wares doesn't reduce in the 8th and 9th centuries in the way that it does for many places of a comparable status. So something's going on. We haven't been able to excavate because we were never able to obtain an excavation permit. One of the things that is a constant bugbear for Byzantine archaeologists in Anatolia is the problem with the Ministry of Tourism and Culture and getting a decent permit to do some work. For those of you who've worked on archaeological sites in Turkey, you'll know that you have a government representative there, a temsilci. And if you have a nice temsilci, which we did on 2 occasions, you can do a lot more than you're supposed to be allowed to do with the survey permit. If you don't have a nice temsilci, which we also had, you can do very little. But we were able to do a lot more than our permit allowed us to do in certain areas, which helped a lot in terms of trying to find a chronology for some of the structures that we found, that we located. So as I said, the ceramic data from Efkaita is in stark contrast to many comparable settlements. It does suggest that the town retained importance as a focus of settlement economy and had a higher profile than many similar settlements, particularly in this area, well into the so-called Dark Ages. So here we might be seeing how the longer-term change in climate could entirely fortuitously have benefited the East Roman Empire at a crucial point in its history by permitting a relative increase in grain production and agropastoral farming that responded to the immediate and maybe increasing demands of the state in its struggle for survival. A similar situation may be reflected in the survey data from the rural hinterland of the ancient coastal settlement of Aigalos, or modern Gide. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention this. Here we have, this is a graph taken from one of the things we wrote back in 2018, just comparing the settlement data from 7 sites from different parts of Asia Minor, from Anatolia. And you can see, if you look at the top, for example, that compared with the trajectory of development in Sinop, Avkat, and Chide are not doing too badly, although there is a drop-off. But Avkat in particular, the data suggests an improvement in its position beginning in the 7th century, before the later 8th century, it begins to lose impetus. Nevertheless, compared with the graphs for Konya and the Göksu project, Balbura and Sagalassos, we see a very different tendency, which seems to me quite significant. So that's the 20-year normalization for site numbers in the GDE survey. And again, look at the figure for rural, and you'll see that the rural averages do not decline as steeply as one might otherwise suspect, whereas the suburban and urban averages do. Another example makes the entanglement of climatic and socio-political developments even more problematic. The pollen data from Lake Nar, as we know, and I talked about this earlier, indicate a radical and dramatic retrenchment of human activity in the period 664 to 678. It's very precisely dated, lasting well into the late 9th and first half of the 10th century. The same data, though, also indicate a recovery some 280 years later, around 950. See my yellow marker across there. This evidence shows a very different configuration of the human economy of the region, with a more obvious emphasis, again, on cereal production and pastoral farming or ranching, in contrast to the earlier profile. The problem here lies in the fact that this change does, in fact, coincide approximately with the shift towards a somewhat more humid climate in the regions in question. But it also coincides with a significant uptick in the socio-economic fortunes of the region. A good indication of the change is offered by the case of the fertile imperial episkepsis, or estate, of Rizion, with its fortress located not far to the south of Lake Nar, as you can see. Oh, I haven't put Lake Nar on there, but that's where Rizion is. A little bit to the northwest is Lake Nar. And the Emperor Nikephoros II passed with his army through this region campaigning into Arab territory in the year 965. A few years later, our textual sources tell us that this estate was temporarily usurped by a senior palace official, Basil, before being restored to imperial control by the Emperor John I in 975. The contemporary written sources suggest that this was a wealthy estate, but that it had only recently been restored to imperial control and made safe from hostile attacks after years of warfare and conflict. So here we have an example of imperial recolonization, if you like, of a landscape. It may well be the activities of imperial estate managers in expanding or re-establishing cereal production, amongst other crops, which the pollen data from Lake Nar for the period from the 950s onwards reflect. It may also reflect the investment strategies of some of the great Anatolian aristocratic landlords of the 10th century and afterwards, who figure very prominently in this period in Byzantine society and politics. By the by, as I pass over Lake Nar, it's worth pointing out that although the evidence does show a more or less complete collapse of anthropogenic pollens, indicative of human agriculture, we shouldn't therefore assume that the landscape was empty of people. It just means that the pollen signature itself is so small that it's not detected. There's plenty of archaeological evidence for continued very small scale rural settlement in Cappadocia, and there are fortresses and fortlets and so forth as well that remained occupied all the way through and are mentioned in the textual evidence to indicate that. However, the pollen signature does demonstrate that from the 660s, 670s onwards, the population of people producing wheat must have collapsed to a dramatically low level. The remarkable economic recovery that took place in Cappadocia and throughout central Anatolia from the middle of the 10th century onwards is reflected also, of course, in new church building or restoration of older churches, in the settlement archaeological evidence, as well as in the written records of the period. While it can be to some extent be attributed to imperial military successes, coupled with the dynamism of the aristocratic elite that spearheaded that process, we may wonder to what extent the somewhat more humid climate conditions that set in during the second half of the 10th century also contributed to the process of economic recovery and expansion across the region, as well as to the development of the agro-pastoral economy that brought new wealth both to the elite and to the area. I've already mentioned that this agro-pastoralism appears to be peculiar to the evolution of Anatolian landscapes from the late 7th and early 8th centuries, although there is, as I said, evidence that it begins in some areas already in the 5th. So this isn't just to do with what happens in the late Roman period, in the early Byzantine period. As an example, the as yet unpublished pollen data from Buldan Yayla, which I mentioned earlier from Lake Buldan, in the central Meander Valley, indicates a similar development after the breakdown of the older Hellenistic Roman agricultural pattern. Again, the continued but greatly reduced olive cultivation in the southwest and west, apparent in the pollen record, seems to have had little direct causal association with shifts in regional climate regime, but rather reflected the needs and priorities of rural communities, exchange networks, as well as perhaps the state's fiscal and military administration. And in the central and northern Balkans, by contrast, while agricultural expansion and repopulation coincided with the re-establishment of imperial authority administration, attested in both the archaeology and the pollen record during the 11th century, these socio-political changes post-date by a century changes in climate to a more beneficial climate regime. All this just goes to underline what we already know, but often don't take into account enough, in my view, and that the relation between society and climate is both complex and non-deterministic. The same conditions can have radically different implications dependent on the social, political, and ecological context in question. Our evidence is also by no means good enough to draw really solid conclusions yet. A lot remains hypothetical and liable to revision as new data appears. To cite just one example, the paleoclimate data for the 920s indicates stronger snow accumulation as reconstructed from the Kocain cave record, and an increased frequency of cold winters in Byzantine lands that show much colder winter temperature conditions for a few years. Such conditions could be linked to the short-term subsistence crises reported by the historical sources for that decade, one outcome of which was the so-called Great Famine of the years 927-928. Are we entitled here to assume a causal connection or merely a magnification of problems that were already present? Equally, there are instances where agricultural activity appears not to have been significantly impacted during a period of relative aridity. By the same token, more humid conditions did not necessarily lead to greater productivity or intensification of agriculture. This is actually, again, something which Jacobson et al. Have shown for Southwest Anatolia based on the Cochin record. This is also very clearly the case during the period stretching from the first millennium BCE to the medieval period in southwestern Anatolia in the Roman provinces of Lycia and Pamphylia. So what I've tried to do to conclude is just to suggest both how helpful combining these different types of evidence can be, but at the same time, how very, very cautious we need to be. And I haven't mentioned by any means all the problems. For example, the methodologies employed by the climate scientists in analyzing their data, the means of acquiring a chronology and so forth. This isn't a new point, but it's one we're all still wrestling with. And I hope at least that what I've been saying provides some food for thought. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. This is really fascinating because, as you said, this is what I was exactly thinking. You know, we have all these different sorts of data that we have to bring together. And, you know, looking at one single data, it just shows, your talk shows how misleading it can be to depend on one sort of data and come to conclusions about this, whereas another type of data is completely changing the picture. And it's a huge task for archaeologists, I think, and it's a very pressing task too. You know, I feel very overwhelmed by the kinds of data that we have to take into account, looking at our sites or, you know, working in our regions. And certainly this is also eye-opening because we tend to feel a bit overwhelmed by this environmental data, climatic data, and have a tendency to leave it to the scientists, you know, hard scientists.
Yeah.
But actually, this is exactly what we have to be doing to, you know, use this data, understand this data, and use it in our interpretation of the work we do. And I think I'll be going back to all of these publications you have mentioned and more that I've been coming across in the recent months and try to adapt this kind of a thinking to my own work. So this is what I would like to say. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there'll be questions for you. So I open the floor for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Burcu.
Anyone?
Fahri Dikaya is
Clapping. Yes. Thank you, Fahri.
If possible, I can ask a question, Hocam.
Yes, Bora, please.
Thank you, Professor. It was a wonderful and comprehensive presentation. Thank you. If I am not mistaken, you state that Pontus and Paphlagonia, especially from the end of the Middle Byzantine period, became more important as a source of grain and wheat. Can we also express the effort of John Komnenos to recapture the Bolu, Tokat, and Niksar region in 1139 and 40 with this importance, or had this feature already disappeared by the 12th century? The sources state that the Roman people continued to exist here. Could one of the reasons for the rapid rise of Danishmends be the ongoing agricultural power? Thank you.
That's a really good point. And it actually, strangely enough, it was something that Burcu and I and Maxime were talking about before the meeting began, because not enough historians and archaeologists have really thought about bringing this material all together for the early Turkish conquest period, particularly the Turkmen occupation of the center and the rise of these different dynasties, Seljuk, Danishmendid, and so forth. So Paphlagonia, or some of it anyway, um, bearing in mind that our evidence is indicative rather than very concrete, but Paphlagonia Pontus does seem from the 8th century on to become increasingly important. And we have a few indications of that in texts, hagiographical texts primarily, but they're all just as valuable as historical texts in that respect. I see no reason at all to doubt that the production of wheat in this region did not continue to be important to Constantinople. And indeed, it probably became more important again, if it had lost any importance, in the course of the middle and later 11th and early 12th centuries because of the loss of central Anatolia or the lack of control over central Anatolia. Um, the reason I say that is because we have in the 10th century one or two very important references to the supply of substantial amounts of wheat from southern Galatia, Cappadocia, the province of Anatolikon, and the movement of that material, presumably at enormous expense, from that region to Kush Adasa and the region of there's a Byzantine naval base there, close to Ephesus, for a campaign. That would have taken several weeks with very expensive ox carts to transport it. Obviously, as we know, land transport in medieval times is really expensive and time consuming. But clearly, this Anatolikon region had become important again for wheat for the empire. It may have always been important. We don't know. We have no evidence at all. The pollen data from the regions close to Amorion, for example, would indicate continual cereal production, but they're not really. They don't really tell us whether this is a new thing or whether it's an ongoing tradition. But I think the interest of the empire in maintaining control of that Western Pontic zone has to be, at least in part, as well as strategic, has to be economic. And supplying Constantinople with grain, which was done from coastal ports like Amastris, possibly Sinop, possibly Trabzon, right across into to Constantinople, was undoubtedly something which the empire wanted to try to maintain. However, it's not something I've worked on myself, and I'm sort of guessing based on the sort of logic of the argument, as it were. One would need to test the argument out by looking more carefully at the sources.
Thank you, hocam.
Any other questions? Maybe.
Yes,
Nicola, yes, please.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, you're the great master at expanding our awareness to other realms of scholarship, and I always appreciate that. I'm wondering if you encountered any evidence of kind of subjective awareness of changes in climate. Is there any moment in historical sources where people living at the time are saying something like, we cannot cultivate that anymore, or something like that? Or are those changes always happening on too large a scale for people to actually perceive them back then?
That's a good question. So there are not a huge number, but there are plenty of references in a range of different types of source to the weather and to climate, usually to extreme events such as droughts or famines, inspired by which attributed to drought, or heavy rainstorms, or famously, icebergs in the Propontis crashing into the walls of the city and that sort of thing. So extreme events are frequently mentioned. Mostly representing a Constantinopolitan perspective, sometimes representing a provincial or more distant perspective. And you can use those to say a little bit about whether these are exceptions to the standard climatic pattern or whether they seem to fit in. And mostly they fit in to the ups and downs of a particular climate regime. However, you're also right in suggesting that the chronology of change is usually not specific enough for people to look back a generation and say, oh, it was better in my granddad's day or whatever it happens to be. So we don't get any indications of that sort that I'm aware of, at least, at this period. So on the whole, I think we're dependent on the sort of fairly generally accepted anthropological model that farmers, when things begin to change, generally respond in a way that is conservative, in the sense that they're trying to maintain what they've always done under new conditions, and they'll try to maintain the way they've done things until those ways become unsuccessful. And then, depending on where they're located, what their connections are, what their local knowledge of their environment might be, and so forth, they'll alter the relationship between their different their agricultural outputs, growing less of one thing and more of another, and so forth. And we have plenty of evidence for that, not just from the medieval period, but from ancient as well as more recent times. So I think on the whole, we can assume, and I think this is pretty usual, a substantial amount of resilient response of agrarian communities, but with exceptions depending on a particular conjuncture or moment. Additionally, we need to bear in mind attitudes and beliefs about the world around them, because that also plays a role in how people respond. And there are some very good examples from other cultures about a response that seems to be entirely counterproductive, but which is tied into a belief system which inhibits people changing the way they do things. So I think the short answer is there isn't anything of the sort that you were mentioning. If we had a higher level of literacy and more record keeping in across the Byzantine period, then we might be able to say something. One area of research which one could pursue, and I don't think anyone's done this, for the late Byzantine period, especially from the Paleolog period, especially from the 13th and 14th and early 15th centuries into the Ottoman period, we have a huge number of letter collections written by Byzantines in and around Constantinople or Thessaloniki or the Peloponnese or wherever. And they are often simply exercises in literary and rhetorical skill and classical education, but equally they do include, from time to time, if you trawl through the material, references to daily life and local issues and so forth. And I think if somebody would take the trouble, there's a good PhD there for somebody, take the trouble to go through that material and see what it might tell us about attitudes to climate and weather and changes and so forth. Particularly because, of course, the 14th century in particular is a period of substantial change, also epidemic disease and so forth, the Black Death. So one could probably find indications there if one wanted to. And of course, that's also a time at which people are much more conscious of the cultures around them. So there's plenty of comment from Byzantines about either their relations with the Balkan powers to the north or with the Ottomans and other Turks to the south and east. So I don't think I've been able to answer your question in a way that you might have hoped, but that's the answer I can offer.
That's great. I mean, it's yeah, that's great. It's still very interesting. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
I would have one more, methodological and confessing my ignorance about the earlier, Byzantine and even going into later Byzantine period, that are overlapping with the time period of, Danish Mandate and Seljuk and all of this medieval what kind of sources and textual sources could we rely on to compare with all of the archaeological data to understand this, rural lands and management and all, as you mentioned, the Ottoman sources for this, for instance. But I was curious of what kind of a document could you use as a comparative documentation for archaeological data?
So the reason I mentioned the Ottoman documents is because, as you know, they there are hundreds of thousands of them, which many haven't even been catalogued. I mean, the Başbakanlık Archive is full of material that we don't even know about, which is a tragedy, it seems to me. I once suggested to an Ottomanist colleague that he could persuade the Turkish government to invest several billion euros in a massive research team to do that, but he decided that was not worth his time to ask. The sorts of evidence we use for the Byzantine period, it's virtually everything, every type of written documentation we can get, from state archival materials, tax registers, and so forth, which are not common. There aren't very many of them. Archival records from land sales, particularly in the period from the 10th to the 15th century, from the monasteries, which are a very substantial archive, which includes a huge amount of really important information about peasant society and peasant life, as well as land tenure practices, the law, and so forth. Historical accounts and textual, just regular documentary accounts of events, because they often include, I mean, basically everything, letters, you name the genre, and if it exists, we have to try and use it, because we are relatively archivally impoverished, especially for the early and middle Byzantine periods, for the 7th century up to the 10th and 11th centuries. Using the Ottoman documents was simply a way of trying to find out what the landscape looked like and what the tax revenue that could be raised from that landscape looked like in the early Ottoman period. But actually, given the slow transition in agricultural technology from the medieval period right across to the Republican Revolution, even the early Republican archival documents on wheat production, for example, are useful, because they give an indication of the way in which the landscape was both settled and in which it was exploited. And so we can try to use everything, obviously with care, because methodologically there are all sorts of problems with using that material in that way. But it's been done with some success. Michael Hendy, the well-known Byzantine economic historian, made very good use of the Ottoman documents in that respect. And one of the ways in which he did that was to calculate the gross income of various Ottoman provinces based on the Ottoman documentation of the 16th and 17th centuries, and compare it with the statistics we have. And we have a few very detailed statistics from the late Roman period, especially from the 4th and 5th centuries, on provincial revenues in both gold and in terms of cereals or whatever. And the continuities were surprising. I mean, the level of production in a populated and under decent climatic conditions in a reasonably well populated region of the Roman world were about the same as in the early Ottoman world. So there are very few changes until you get those big technological transformations in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that's where we use the Ottoman material, really just as a comparative statistic against which to measure our other evidence.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other comment?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to go back to something that Borju said at the end of when I finished speaking. The problems we face, one of one of the things that our project, Climate Change and History Research Initiative, has been trying to do is to bring scientists and historians and archaeologists together on a face-to-face basis, and it's proved extremely fruitful because it turns out that everybody is deeply ignorant of everybody else's specialism. And we found we didn't really know how to use what the scientists were giving us, but they had no idea how to interpret historical stuff. And the problem I've met with the scientists, and I've worked quite closely now with several people in both big projects and little projects, is that because they're not familiar with the historical evidence, there's a general assumption that history is straightforward and you can just write a narrative and then you can measure things against that narrative. And that means that when you have an important climate event, which they can document very precisely, they want it to be societally important. And they find it difficult not to say, well, it must have been important. And I keep saying, well, it might have been important, but it's not the case of it must have been. We need to prove that it must have been if it was. And some of you might be familiar with an article I wrote with some colleagues in Basel a few years ago, looking at the importance of a very clearly marked and very, very significant severe drought event indicated an important speleothem from a cave in Oman. And the scientists wanted to say, and this is based, I mean, we can pinpoint the height of this. It's the worst drought in that region for nearly several thousand years. And the height of it is in the early 520s CE, just at the point when there are severe political problems between the East Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Ethiopia, and the Kingdom of Himyar, based in Yemen. And they wanted to argue that the drought caused the collapse of the Kingdom of Himyar and led to the rise of Islam. And I, of course, fainted with shock and horror at the idea that they wanted to say Islam was caused by a climate change. Firstly, I had to avoid having a fatwa announced against me. But secondly, I also needed to make it clear to the scientists that that sort of facile reductionism was really completely unacceptable. And we needed to think much more sophisticatedly about the interconnections between climate, politics, economics, and belief systems and so forth. So the connections can be made, but they have to be made very carefully and cautiously, and they have to be shown to be multi-layered and multifaceted, as it were. I don't blame the colleagues at all. They were just doing what they do best. And they were perfectly happy to be told that that wasn't good enough and that it shouldn't be published in a historical context. In the end, we wrote two versions of the article, one for scientists and one for historians. And I confess that the one for historians was mostly written by me, and it was about 15 times longer than the scientific one.
Thank you for that. I think we each think too highly of ourselves when it comes to our own fields of expertise, and we have to kind of give each other some space to be able to create that kind of communication between each other. I mean, this is true in general for archaeology, but also this is especially true for the medieval period. And we have been discussing with Maxime a lot about this, how art history, archaeology, how hard it is to bring them together, to work together, and to make a meaning together of this period. So I'm quite happy that this talk series is kind of is a step forward for this. But if there's no other questions, I have one. I'm really interested to know what the climatic data from the northern part of the Black Sea is for this period, for this, especially the drought that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have access to this kind of data, information from Crimea or other parts of northern Black Sea?
So I would need to check with my palynological friends to find out. I confess I haven't really done any research on that, so it's
Mhm,
possible there are some data, but I suspect if there are such data, they're very rare and unusual.
mhm,
Um, a lot depends on the context. Of course, we know about the big excavations of Kherson and Pantikapaon and some of the Hellenistic and classical
mhm,
sites. I haven't checked to see if they include paleoecological data sets,
mhm,
and it's possible that they may do.
mhm,
Um, I do have some. I've got several articles which are relatively up to date on Kerch and
mhm.
on um, some of the other sites around it, and I'll have to check to see if there's any reference to that sort of material.
Yes, I
Um,
think it would be very interesting and important to know that because when we look at the northern part of Anatolia, or the Black Sea, we kind of tend to draw a line, a couple, maybe some kilometers into the sea, north towards the north, and we tend to look at the coast and then the inland and then central Anatolia. But in fact, we really have to see the Black Sea as a whole, system, a network, an economic network, a
yeah.
political network, a social and cultural network. So I think it would be very interesting to bring in this data from around the Black Sea to see how those parts of the basin is affected by this climate change and how that affects in the larger picture of cultural, economical, political life in the Black Sea Basin.
Yeah.
Irina I see that she turned on her camera. Maybe Irina can tell us if there's such data.
Hello, and thank you so much for this really interesting lecture. I saw on your map the Crimea and the economy, wine and pottery production. It's really point that we know a lot indeed especially for the 8th, 10th century. But a special study about the climate we don't have, unfortunately, for Crimea.
Mm.
Only a lot of information deal with the agriculture, with the grape and wine production. It's a point that I'm interested in for the 8th, 9th century. But we don't have the information about the climate. Nobody deal with this, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it will be nice to compare the data about the agricultural production with this period in Anatolia, for example, and explain why we observe this really boom of the grape production, pottery production in Crimea for this period.
Yeah, yeah.
Some economical, I don't know, it's kind of for the 9th century, it's really kind of the hub of wine production there and wine exported in Volga region.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be interesting to understand how are there any kind of such scale of pottery production, especially in Anatolia for this time, and where this production go.
Yes, no, I agree.
I expected of you actually,
Yeah.
and I have a lot of point to foresee for the future.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about Crimea is that it is today a big wheat producing area, as far as I'm aware, in parts, and it was in Hellenistic times, but it's not clear that it was in the medieval period, and I don't know whether that's a false picture because we don't have sources. In the 10th century, as you know, Constantine VII says that Crimea has to receive grain from the Pontus to survive. But that seems, I mean, I don't know to what extent that can be true, because I was always under the impression that Crimea had been a bit sort of fairly reasonable, certainly in terms of supporting itself, a fairly good producer of grain, of cereal. So I think it would be good if we had more paleoecological data to tell us about the proportion between vine, olive, cereals, and livestock as well.
Yeah, but in Crimea, not really exists the production of olive oil. It's not a climate condition for this, good climate condition for this.
No.
The grape production, especially in south part and in mountain area, was really huge.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And cereals, it's maybe for the steppe area, not for the mountain, not for the southern Crimea.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So there seems to be a big gap there, which could be also an exciting project to build upon. Any other questions or comments?
I'd just like to say thank you to all the people who came to, switched on to listen to the talk. Thank you for coming.
Yes, and we would like to thank you for coming and sharing your expertise and all this really thought-provoking, as Lutz says in the chat, talk. So, Maxime, would you like to do the announcement for the next? Are you ready? Okay, so I leave it to you.
Thank you. So thank you. And to thank you again, John, for this very, very fascinating lecture that I think gave us a lot to think and to think about for new project. As I'm sure the next lecture will do also. So the next one will be on the 15th of May. We will have the pleasure to listen to Farid Dikaya about early Ottoman state, and this will be the last lecture of this talk series. But we will tell you more in May because we will have more information. But we promise you at the beginning of a follow-up a conference in Istanbul, and this will be organized in the beginning of 2026. But we'll give you more information about this later on. So thank you very much to all people who were here to attend the lecture, and thank you to John again for this very fascinating lecture, and thanks to you, Borjo, also for the introduction and discussion. And this will be set up online also on the IFAIR YouTube channel.
And our last talk has been broadcasted now. Just yesterday, I saw IFAIR's Facebook share or some social media share, so you can go and check the most recent one already. Oya's, I think. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, all.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.